Center in Paris. Welcome to this webinar, the first of two sessions today. Just a few housekeeping rules to think about. First of all, we will be recording this webinar, and we will share the recording with everybody afterwards, all registered participants. You can ask questions in the Q&A function, but be mindful that we also have dedicated Q&A sessions after both panels. So without further ado, let's start the webinar by just taking a glimpse, 1-minute video to introduce the guidelines.
Well, welcome to everyone, and it's great to see such an overwhelming interest in joining our webinar today. On behalf of the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct, I warmly welcome you to this webinar on the updated OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises on responsible business conduct. As we saw in our little film here at the opening, the guidelines are recommendations by governments to businesses, and they are based on the premise that responsible business conduct is a precondition for a sustainable future, or as we say at the OECD, responsible today, sustainable tomorrow. The guidelines and their government-backed recommendations are embedded in business practice and public policy across the world. They underpin the work of trade unions and civil society representing millions of people across global supply chains. They are, in short, part of the source code for the rules-based trade and investment system. This year on June 8th, the OECD released its most recent update of the guidelines. This is the first update since 2011. With this update, governments have renewed their commitment to responsible business conduct with recommendations that are fit for addressing the sustainability challenges of our time. In this webinar, we're going to be unboxing the updated guidelines to look at what is new and why the changes matter. We are going to hear reactions from businesses, from trade unions and civil society. We will hear from governments about their priorities for the implementation of the updated guidelines. And lastly, we will, of course, look forward to hear the reactions and the questions from you in the audience. But first, for the unboxing of the updated guidelines, I'm really pleased to hand the floor to Catherine Dovey from the OECD Center for Responsible Business Conduct. Catherine, over to you.
Many thanks, Alan, and welcome to everybody who's joining today. It's wonderful to be with you all. So I'm going to run through the main changes that have occurred in our guidelines. As I'm sure you're all aware, we have 11 chapters in the guidelines and a set of procedures that speak directly to the national contact points. Our procedures and our chapters make up the bulk of the guidelines, and that's what I'll run through today because we've seen changes across all of them. But before all of that, I want to say a quick word about our preface and what's new in the preface. This really sets the tone for the guidelines in total. And across the preface, there are three main updates to flag. The first is that they now recognize the context, the international context in which businesses operate. There's a word in there with regards risk-based due diligence, which runs throughout the guidelines, as mentioned earlier. And they recognize the role of the government in creating an enabling environment through new policies, regulation, etc., the smart mix that we speak of. Then with regards to changes to chapters 1 and 2, chapters 1 and 2 are called Concepts and Principles and General Policies. They're relatively innocuous titles, but there's a lot that's changed in here that's relevant for our discussion today. Things like, what are the types of factors that you look at when deciding whether a multinational enterprise actually falls within the scope of the guidelines? There's reminders in there with regards to what we mean by risk-based due diligence, including the 6-step framework. We speak about the importance of meaningful consultation, the importance of responsible engagement and disengagement, and we unpack and define what is meant by business relationships. And it's worth pausing for a second there. We deliberately give a broad definition to the concept of business relationships. A lot of talk about upstream and downstream in this context. We don't use those terms explicitly, but we do make it clear that it's a broad definition with regards to supply chain. We speak also about the importance of refraining from and taking steps to prevent reprisals and ensuring that transparency and integrity exist with regards to lobbying activities. And then finally, in these chapters, you will find some words with regards to the alignment of self-regulatory initiatives and multi-stakeholder initiatives in terms of international standards, such as the guidelines. So a whole host of topics covered here. On the disclosure chapter, which is where we start to get really into the meat of the thematic chapters, the main point to note here is that you now see alignment between our guidelines and the G20 OECD principles of corporate governance, including things like beneficial ownership, board composition, and materiality. There's also content in there with regards to disclosing RBC information in line with the due diligence model, and the importance of due diligence in supporting companies when identifying material risks and impacts. Finally, we note in the guidelines that RBC information can be considered material if its omission or misstatement could reasonably impact an investor's assessment. So that's with regards to disclosure. The next chapter is human rights, and there haven't been many changes here because, of course, as I'm sure you're all aware, the human rights chapter was added back in 2011 and is aligned with UN guiding principles. So we didn't need to amend this too much. But we do have some new language with regards at-risk individuals and groups, such as human rights defenders or indigenous peoples. The guidelines also now note that our other due diligence guidance explicitly provides information in terms of FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent. So that's an important addition. And now this chapter also recognizes the need for what we call enhanced due diligence in the context of armed conflicts or the risk, whether there's a risk of gross human rights abuses. Moving on then to the employment chapter, by way of a headline, there's now recognition in this chapter that the rights of all workers to freedom of association and collective bargaining have been recognized. This was previously limited to those employed by the company. The importance of providing a safe and healthy working environment has been recognized because, of course, that was added to the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work recently. There's new language in there with regards preventing human trafficking, and there's some new terms around training for upskilling and reskilling, notably with regards to changes that will come related to automation and other environmental changes. Then we come to the environment chapter. Now, this chapter, along with our science, technology, and innovation chapter, has really seen the most changes. Not surprising on the environment side, given that it had not been updated in a while, and there have been so many developments at the international level on this topic. So there's a lot to talk about here, and I should flag that on the 19th of October, we will have a new webinar specifically dedicated to this chapter. The big headline to take away, though, is that due to the changes in this chapter, the guidelines now represent the first internationally agreed standard for how businesses should address climate change. So let me dig into that a little bit more. So firstly, with regards impacts and due diligence. So we've applied the lens of due diligence to adverse environmental impacts. There's now a non-exhaustive list at the start of this chapter of environmental impacts that may be associated with business activities, including obviously climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, etc. We applied cause, contribute, and directly linked to these environmental impacts. And we recognize the interlinkages between environmental impacts and other areas of human rights, for instance, health and safety, impacts to workers, communities, land rights, etc. You'll also find now in this chapter the importance of a just transition being underscored and that terminology being used. On climate change, so like I said, the guidelines now emphasize that companies should ensure their greenhouse gas emissions and impact on carbon sinks are consistent with internationally agreed temperature goals based on best available science. But they also encourage the companies to create those science-based targets and note the importance of reviewing those targets regularly. And finally, the guidelines note that companies should avoid activities that undermine climate adaptation for and resilience of communities, workers, and ecosystems. On biodiversity, the chapter notes that companies need to contribute to the conservation of biological diversity, whether it's land, marine, freshwater, etc. And note that where appropriate, companies should contribute to sustainable land and forest management, including reforestation, afforestation, etc. The circular economy is in there, that's new, so in relation to sustainable consumption and production. And then finally, something else that's new is animal welfare, noting that companies should respect animal welfare standards aligned with the World Organization for Animal Health. Next up is bribery and corruption. Again, the headline here, just to be succinct, is that the chapter has been expanded to cover all types of corruption, not just bribery. So things like trading in influence, embezzlement, misuse of sponsorships, etc. The chapter recognizes that adverse impacts on matters covered by the guidelines elsewhere are often enabled by means of corruption. And it encourages collective action and meaningful engagement with local and international civil society organizations to combat these issues. Not much has changed with regards to consumer interests. Just a couple of things to flag very quickly. The importance of companies taking steps to reduce the risk of e-commerce, and noting that any sustainability-related product claims have to be based on adequate evidence, tests, etc. Then we come to science, technology, and innovation. And as I mentioned, this one has seen a number of updates, and we will be doing a dedicated webinar on this topic on the 5th of October. This chapter really used to be about technological transfer and the benefits of this sector in the wider society. And the big change that's happened here is that we've now expanded risk-based due diligence to cover this chapter. Previously, there was a carve-out for it, along with competition and taxation. So that means that you're looking at your actual and potential impacts relating to science, technology, and innovation, including development, financing, sale, licensing, and use of technology. So that's an important change. There's also new language in there with regards to responsible data governance, looking at high-risk contexts, digital security risk management, and finally, the importance of protecting children and youth with regards to those activities and making their best interests a primary consideration. Couple more words then with regards to competition, which again saw few changes. It notes that RBC initiatives are not inherently in tension with competition law. It's an important addition. And that companies may be subject to competition law when buying labour input. So they're the main changes there. And then finally, one change with regards to the taxation chapter, which now highlights the provisions of the BEPS project, base erosion profit shifting, which you may be familiar with. So there's alignment there with other work going on at the OECD. So that's the chapters complete, bit of a whistle-stop tour, but we look forward to hearing your questions on it. Finally, a quick word then with regards to what's changed in terms of the procedures for the national contact points for responsible business conduct. So firstly, we've clarified the language around the effectiveness criteria. That's really the baseline that's expected of all national contact points globally. Importantly, the peer reviews that the OECD carries out of NCPs have now been made mandatory and periodic, whereas previously they were voluntary. There's been some tightening of the language with regards to the initial assessment, so the first exercise that NCPs do when they receive a case, and notably new language around coordination on a case, because cases will often involve multiple NCPs at the same time. So that's been clarified. It's been clarified that NCPs will always make a public statement at closure. And now that making recommendations and carrying out follow-up after the close of the case is the norm and expected of NCPs. Similarly, the language has been clarified around what we mean by transparency and confidentiality in this context. And there's a new provision in there noting that NCPs can support policy coherence on responsible business conduct. And finally, but importantly, there's a recommendation that all NCPs take appropriate steps to address the risk of reprisals against parties to a specific instance. So that's it for me. From me, I'm going to hand back briefly now to Alan to say a word about our new recommendation, which speaks directly to governments.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'll briefly just mention a related development at the OECD regarding responsible business conduct. Last year, the OECD issued a new set of recommendations, which are recommendations for governments on how to promote responsible business conduct. You will recall that the guidelines that we're unboxing today are recommendations by governments to businesses. So the new recommendation on the role of government in promoting responsible business conduct are really government's commitments to how they will promote RBC in parallel. One key notable feature of the recommendation is that governments are recommending to develop and enforce a legal and regulatory framework that enables responsible business conduct. And in doing so, and in developing public policies for this purpose, they are recommending to do so in close alignment with the provisions of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises and the associated due diligence guidance. So this is not an instrument we will go into in great detail today, but it is an important development alongside the update of the OECD guidelines. Now, I can see that there are many questions in terms of where can I get more detail on the actual updates that Catherine just went through in her whistle-stop tour. And we will put a link in the chat to where you can find a little bit of a cheat sheet that will summarize the changes for you chapter by chapter. So hopefully that will be useful for everyone. I'm really pleased to now turn to our first panel. The process of updating the guidelines has involved close collaboration and consultation with businesses, with trade unions and civil society. And indeed, the guidelines themselves are based on the premise that all stakeholders in society take part in their implementation. So I will now turn to get some reactions from our key stakeholders who deal with responsible business conduct issues on a daily basis. So in our panel, I'm really pleased to welcome Lucia van Westerlaak, who is chair of the TUAC Working Group on Multinational Enterprises, representing, in fact, trade unions at the OECD, having been closely involved in the update of the guidelines. Similarly, I'm pleased to welcome John Carlin, who is Executive Director of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International and an associate also of OECD Watch, who represents civil society at the OECD. And last but not least, of course, I'm very pleased to welcome also to the panel here, Winan Kvetvlieg, who's chair of the Investment Committee of Business at the OECD, representing businesses at the OECD. So we have a couple of questions for Lucia and Joe and Winan, and I'll start with you, Lucia. In what you've heard, and you've of course been closely following this update, what matters the most to you about the updated guidelines and why?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to talk to you all. First, I would like to congratulate the OECD and also all of us with the renewed content. I think we have a lot of substantiated improvements now, and we need them. We need them really. And what matters most to us workers, two things that I would like to add to what Catherine said about chapter 5. One is that there's also an improvement on companies that shouldn't interfere with workers that want to form a union. That's one thing that we think is very important in many parts of the world. And the other thing is that a living wage is important not only in the poor countries, but all countries in the world. We also have an improvement over there. So that's one thing I want to highlight too. Then after that, I would like to say that everything stands or falls, as we say it in the Netherlands, with implementation. So the text is really an improvement. The content is an improvement for workers, for I think a lot of stakeholders. At the same time, we know that everything depends on a good functioning national contact point, on a government that wants to align its own policy, that looks into its instruments and sees if there is anything that could be better structured on RBC arguments, like, as we know, subsidy or place in a trade mission or export credit, or the funds that we know, there's always funds that are, for instance, important for making our industries greener. Green is really needed, but do it in a way that it is socially also responsible. That I would like to say. I also have to say that in the Netherlands, we work together with the employers a lot on the RBC instruments and on the OECD guidelines. Maybe that, as an example, we have roadshows throughout sectors in which we highlight the OECD guidelines and what they mean and what they should mean to business. And I was there in a roadshow for the metal industry last week. Lots of MK, what do you say, small and larger business companies that really don't have a clue. They don't have a clue. They don't know anything about due diligence, why it is important, why they should work with it, but they are open. Why are they open right now? Because the EU is making up a directive on RBC. And so they are really aware of, they need to know within a few years everything about this, about RBC and what it is. So I also would like to say that consequences help us. Consequences that are being proposed by governments and are being put into practice by governments do help us to make business aware of the urge, of the necessity of this work. We in the Netherlands have a very good functioning NCP, I dare to say. We work together with the employers a lot on this in this field. So maybe something that Bia could touch upon, how could we make that a reality in other OECD countries? Because it helps a lot, in our opinion. So maybe, Wienand, in a few minutes, could you touch upon that? That's, I think, the most important things that I would like to say. One thing more, implementation. One thing more, just to end. Governments should also think about their role in public procurement. They set an example, whether they want to or not, but they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lucy. And I will come back to you on those points on implementation that you sort of already started to touch on. Because, of course, having a text is one thing, having it implemented is something entirely different. And it's indeed wonderful to have a panel where the participants are already starting to talk to each other. So hopefully we can keep that tone. Turning to you, John Carlin, and I know you join us from lovely surroundings. And I know from speaking to you before that is not a fake background. So in what you see in the update of the guidelines from your perspective, what to you stands out the most as the most important, and why?
Okay, I will be speaking from the perspective of indigenous peoples. So there are two main sections that are very, very important and relevant for indigenous peoples. The first one is the strengthened section on human rights. Under that section, we are finally mentioned. Indigenous peoples is particularly mentioned needing particular attention. And it refers also to it made reference to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and to free, prior, and informed consent. For us, that is very, very important because the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples set out the minimum standard for the respect and protection of the individual and collective rights of indigenous peoples. And the second point on the free, prior, and informed consent, from our perspective, operationalizes the respect of our collective rights to our lands, territories, and resources in a way that we become part of the decision on matters that affects these rights. So the free, prior, and informed consent becomes then a social license to operate for business enterprises. Then part of this, under this human rights section, is the conduct of human rights due diligence. And with the conduct of human rights due diligence, from our perspective, the human rights due diligence refers to how our rights as indigenous peoples are going to be respected and protected. And within this, it requires a meaningful stakeholders engagement as a key component of the human rights due diligence. And I would like to quote what is in the guideline in relation to this. To ensure stakeholder engagement is meaningful and effective, it is important to ensure that it is timely, accessible, appropriate, and safe for stakeholders, and to identify and remove potential barriers to engaging with stakeholders in positions of vulnerability or marginalization. So it's very clear in this that indigenous peoples as vulnerable and marginalized needs to have an effective engagement mechanism that also takes into account the circumstances. It means barriers. How do we remove barriers? And in the context of indigenous peoples, there are challenges: language, education level, geographical locations. These are barriers for our effective engagement. So this is a very important section. And finally, I would like to go into the environment protection. We believe this is important in the context that it is now aligned to to climate change and biodiversity agreements. And if we recall now, under the biodiversity agreement, we have the 30 by 30 or the global biodiversity framework. And in this context, there are the implication on environment protection and degradation is going to impact indigenous peoples. One is in relation to conservation. There's a threat for us for possible eviction in this context. But on the other hand, the issue of green transition under climate change, with particularly the issue of mining for mineral, for transition minerals, is again going to happen in our territories simply because we have the minerals in our territories. More than half of the transition minerals are in our territories. So so we need to be part of the decision in this, right? And so the environment protection should not be in isolation also to the respect for human rights from the perspective of indigenous peoples, so that we don't become victims again of steps to advance solutions to climate change or biodiversity protection, but that we are actually considered as key actors and partners in this global objectives, because we do take care of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. I will be tough on you on the second round on time, given you looked a bit over.
Sorry.
But thank you for that. And I think you also very clearly illustrate how different aspects of the guidelines, actually across several chapters of the guidelines that you just covered, work to reinforce and should really be read as a whole, as a kind of bridging framework. So thank you for that. And I see that there are many questions already in the chat for our panelists. So we look forward to a vibrant discussion later in the webinar. I'm going to turn to Winand Kvetflik now. Winand is representing business at the OECD. I said, of course, that the guidelines are the business of all stakeholders, but they are, of course, recommendations directly to business. So there's a lot to do for your members, Winand. What in the update do you think matters the most, and why? You are on mute, I believe, Winand.
Yeah, unmuting always helps. Alan, thank you for giving me the floor, and so that I can present the views of business at OECD on the guidelines review. Lucia asked some questions. I will come back to that in the answer on the second question. First, for business at OECD, three things were important in the updated text, and that is, to start with, the key concepts of the guidelines are preserved. For us, the key concepts are, in the first place, the unique voluntary character of the guidelines. In the second place, a clear distinction in treatment between the own acts of a company, when you really cause an adverse impact yourself, or whether they are acts of others in the chain. And the third key characteristic is the application of the notions of proportionality and prioritization, because a company cannot be responsible for everything when it has tens of thousands of suppliers. A second thing that is important for us in the updated text is the strengthening of the functioning of the NCPs while keeping the flexibility in terms of setup of the NCPs. And the third important element is finding the right balance between ambition and practicality, because it is in the end business that will have to apply the new recommendations. The guidelines must work, they must be effective, but they must also be workable for business in practice. For us, a major achievement of the review was that the voluntary character of the guidelines has been clarified. This is crucial in the light of discussions on the relation between the OECD guidelines and mandatory legislation developed elsewhere, and also civil jurisdiction. The preface paragraph 5 now states very clearly that the guidelines provide voluntary principles and standards for responsible business conduct, and that matters covered by the guidelines may also, of course, be the subject of domestic law and international commitments, but the guidelines are aspirational. They outline recommendations that may go beyond what enterprises are legally required to comply with. And the paragraph also says that the recommendation from governance that enterprises observe the guidelines is distinct from matters of legal liability and enforcement. Thus, the guidelines, as voluntary instrument, do not automatically create legal liability and do not provide a template for mandatory legislation, because the nature is essentially different and on purpose. So, this, in our view, is absolutely key for the central place that the guidelines occupy and should occupy and have occupied in the world of RBC. The guidelines are a source of aspiration and inspiration, but not a template to be directly transposed into mandatory legislation. Further, the guidelines recognize that business has to operate in a real and often very complex environment. We as business, we don't want a cut and run approach. We want a stay and improve mentality. So to conclude, many elements matter in the new guidelines text. It was a fundamental review, as the overview of Catherine also clearly showed. For business at OECD, the the clarification of the voluntary character stands out as a key element. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean, and also for covering some of the things that have not changed, including the alignment with key concepts such as the risk-based approach, the voluntary nature of the guidelines, and of course we could also add their continued full complementarity and alignment with the UN Guiding Principles and the ILO Tripartite Declaration. And there you also reflected well the discussions that are reflected in the update about the relationship of the guidelines on the one hand and domestic law and matters of legal liability on the other that are key to our discussion. Also going forward on implementation and in relation to the recommendation that I described also earlier. So I'll come back to you on the implementation question, but on that question, Lucia, I'll turn to you first. And I'm afraid you only get 1 minute each on this one. So looking to the future, how do you plan to move forward with implementation for your stakeholders? Starting with you, Lucia, what is TUAC going to do next? And you are also on mute, Lucia.
Most importantly, we go on with what we always do, making our governments aware of what is happening here. Talk to our allies and look into what cases are there that we can bring forward to the NCPs, how we can coordinate that, because we want to work together with our colleagues and make sure that the improvements really will be there for the people that suffer. So that's I think the most important thing. We never stop pushing. We never stop making our the context, our organizations, our government aware. It's a long road. It's an important road, and we will call on our affiliates to be reliable on this and to make sure they work together.
Thank you, Lucia. And I think also in your previous comments, you covered also very practically how important you and other stakeholders are in terms of disseminating the message, and the fact that even though you're a trade union, you can still speak to businesses in a non-adversarial way about what the guidelines are, and you will find an audience. You also pointed out earlier that, of course, the understanding that there may be a consequence gives you an audience. So in that sense, things are connected, and it's an ecosystem that we're talking about.
It surely does. It surely does. And the IBC instrument that has been accepted at the end of 2022 is a very important instrument in this field, of course. We shouldn't forget that. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you, Lucia. Johan, can I turn to you quickly on the same question from a civil society perspective and for Indigenous Peoples' Rights International? What are your priorities now on implementing the new guidelines?
Well, our priorities now is to continue to engage with OECD, governments and business enterprises to push for the implementation of the commitments made. Although even if this is voluntary, it's important that, and we are willing to cooperate in the establishment of effective engagement mechanisms on how this the guideline can be put into operation. We want to be part of the developing the guidance for the operationalization of the free, prior, and informed consent, because that is a critical tool that we believe will as a social license, but also in bridging better improved cooperation between indigenous peoples and companies for responsible business operations. So that is a very critical step forward for the implementation of the guideline. The second is our participation in the development of a human rights policy that should include indigenous people's rights in the policy, as well as our effective participation in doing the human rights due diligence, including also in the conduct of environmental social impact studies, because this is where our perspectives, our concerns should also be addressed, including in identifying appropriate mitigation measures. Because without our participation, our perspective on how our rights are going to be realized will not be taken into account. And more importantly is we want to have an regular engagement mechanism that is ongoing for ongoing dialogues and cooperation at different levels with the OECD at the project level and at the company level, or where this can facilitate better understanding of the perspective of indigenous peoples. And this is where we're coming in, right? In that we will be there to help implement this in good faith, given the commitment on the respect for human rights and protection of the environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. And I think you also previously highlighted how some of the updates even better now support that conversation to take place in a meaningful way for all stakeholders that are involved. And I know that in your work, you have also really highlighted the connections between protecting people and protecting the environment in the transition, and how the two can really and should really go hand in hand. And I think we also see that reflected in the update. Veena, I turn to you for just a 1 minute reflection on implementation. Are you seeing a lot of demand? How will you prioritize your efforts in following up on the update?
Yeah, I see on the clock indeed that I have very little time. So the guidelines have been substantially reviewed and the recommendations have been extended, have been strengthened. The level of detail and the complexity of the text has also increased. And the consequences of a number of provisions is not beforehand self-evident. So there are quite some challenges for the implementation. But at business at OECD, we have a very solid track record on working on the implementation of the 2011 guidelines. The guidelines-related work stream in our organization during the last decade has been one of the most extensive, and it confirms our commitment to responsible business conduct as a complement to an open international trade and investment climate. We have made brochures, organized surveys among our membership, have participated in many conferences and outreach activities. We organized a global workshop with leading global multinationals. We were intensely involved in the drafting of sectoral and general guidances, and we participated in peer reviews. And then I didn't even mention all the activities that our member federations and the member companies of the member federations undertook all over the OECD area. So we intend to continue this work and be constructively engaged in the implementation, also in dialogue with other stakeholders. We expect that at certain instances, our companies will also be confronted with challenges concerning the interpretation or the application of the new guidelines, and we count on the OECD that we can then jointly look for workable solutions. And then, of course, my last sentence, we expect the OECD member states to make the NCPs work. Thanks.
Thank you, Veena. And you underline also some of the complexity of some of the challenges that the updates are grappling with, and that this is obviously not the end of the conversation in terms of the getting to the how and the what. I'm happy that each of our stakeholders have really played the ball or part of the ball into their own courts, through their own commitments to disseminate, use, apply, leverage the updated guidelines that we now have. But it's also noteworthy that each of the stakeholders also play part of the ball into the government court. And it is for that reason that I'm particularly pleased to then now go to our next panel, where we indeed have representatives from some of the governments who took part in the update of the guidelines. The guidelines are recommendations by governments to business, as we have discussed, on the one hand, but they also contain specific commitments by governments to promote their implementation, including by having a functioning and effective national contact point for responsible business conduct. So in our next round, we're going to touch on both of those aspects. And just to briefly introduce our panel here of government representatives, I'm pleased to welcome, first of all, Eric David, who is head of the economic desk of the mission of France to the OECD. Welcome, Eric. I'm also pleased to welcome Minako Kono, who is Deputy Director for the OECD Division in the Economic Affairs Bureau of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan. Welcome, Minako. And last but not least, of course, I'm very pleased to welcome Annika Konert, who is Policy Officer with the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Action of Germany. Eric, I wonder if I can turn to you first and hear from you about your current and upcoming plans for implementation and dissemination of the updated guidelines. Let's take maybe a round first with the panel, that broader question, and then in our next question we will focus specifically on plans on the NCPs. But overall, your upcoming plans and current focus in terms of broadly implementing and disseminating the update. Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much, Helen. I hope you hear me well. Maybe a few words about the first question you mentioned, and I will mainly talk here as the French NCP president. The promotion of the new guidelines are, of course, crucial for us, and we are trying to do that through 4 avenues. The first one is a very traditional one, but a very efficient one too, is through our French NCP website. We have a specific document presenting the main change in the update. We inserted that on our website just after the adoption of the text. We have also inserted in an internet link to the OECD website, and we also changed the name of the French national contact point to adopt the new recommended name, and now we are the French NCP for RBC, and we are applying guidelines for RBC, which is something more clear for everybody. And we now mention what we are really doing. The second avenue is about information through our own NCP members. Here we are in a quite good position because the French NCP is a tripartite one. So inside the NCP, we have representatives from trade unions, from business, and from different ministries. And of course, we asked to our members to have some dissemination in their own members. I mean, trade unions, which are part of the French NCP, talked to the members, talked to their affiliates, made meetings, and it was exactly the same thing with MEDEF, which is a French business association, and it is also something important in terms of policy coherence. The third avenue is a question of having specific and targeted meetings with business. We had that with some specific people, specific representatives, especially in the most sensitive one. We had a specific meeting with the jewelry sector, with textile, with fashion, with retail, and also one very important sector because it is an horizontal one with lawyers and lawyers association. And the fourth one is, of course, meeting with civil society, and we had some meetings with French NGOs or a French-based NGO, because it is important that they can understand how they can be part of the global process. I stop there, but I think it is the main avenues.
Thank you very much, Eric. And you also highlight the advantages of the tripartite structure that you're working within to be able to reach out to the constituencies that can sometimes be difficult for government to reach directly. You also echoed what I think Lucia pointed to earlier, the importance of engaging at a sector level with practical implementation and dissemination. And you didn't even mention that, of course, France has been at the forefront in terms of policymaking with the duty of vigilance law in terms of obviously promoting responsible business conduct through that avenue as well. I'm going to turn to you, Minaku, next. For Japan, can you speak about your current work and also your upcoming plans for implementation and dissemination of the updated guidelines in Japan? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you. Hello, everyone. And about your question, the very first thing we did right after the launching of the updated guideline was, of course, to post it on MOFA's website dedicated to the guidelines and NCP. And we also shared it with relevant ministries and major stakeholders so that they could share it within their areas of responsibility or relevant field. And as for public events, we presented the updated guidelines to our business association, Keidanren, in July, with the presence of Alan himself, and we highly appreciated his contribution. And also in July, at the occasion of the annual meeting of our NCP's advisory body, composed of the representative from business association and trade union, we explained the updated guidelines, especially focusing on the NCP parts. And as for the upcoming plans, we are planning to arrange an event with trade unions in order to explain the new guidelines in coming months. And in addition to these occasions, at the request of some NGOs, for instance, one with focusing on animal welfare, and other trade unions, we have individually explained the updated guidelines on ad hoc basis, and we will continue to do so. And we do think that the translation of the updated guidelines into Japanese would play a crucial role in a dissemination plan. It would be particularly relevant in Japan in order to ensure the implementation of the guidelines by all stakeholders, including SMEs. When we spoke with our business association, Keidanren, they mentioned that the volume of the new guideline is much bigger with added complexity when compared to the 2011 edition. So we received their implicit or rather explicit message that we should work on the translation into Japanese as soon as possible. I also like to mention that through our translation exercise, we are expecting to have substantial input from the expert group of IDE JETRO, specialized in the business and human rights, with which we will have discussion on the guidelines. So we may say that the translation exercise itself could be, in a sense, a good occasion to discuss with relevant experts on the updated guidelines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minaku. You do remind us of the importance of translation, and you mentioned that the Japanese language version of the 2023 edition is underway. And I can say to the audience, I see there are some questions on that the same is the case for other major languages. So we will be launching also the Spanish translation and the Portuguese translation during the autumn in key events in the Latin American region. So that is, of course, a very practical and necessary step. And Minaku, you also outline here the important work of now reaching out to the key stakeholders and socializing the update with them. And of course, building, as you also indicated, on all of the previous work by Japan in issuing guidance for specifically on business and human rights due diligence, for example, in supply chains, and supporting those conversations also in the wider global supply chains, where I know Japan is also an important contributor. Annika, if I may turn to you last with the same question for Germany. What is top of mind now in terms of implementation and dissemination of the updated guidelines?
Thank you so much, Alan, and thanks also for the invitation. It's really great to be here, and it's really great that we can all take the time to discuss the targeted update. I think as Germany, we were very pleased that we came together and were able to update the guidelines. It was absolutely necessary to ensure that the guidelines continue to provide meaningful recommendations, including on today's key challenges from climate change, biodiversity loss, and more. So that the guidelines are really able to do their part in the transition towards a sustainable economy. But setting the standards is maybe, I don't want to say the easy thing, but it's the one thing. And the second thing, and I think several of the speakers had said that, is implementation. And I think the governments, the national contact points where I sit, but also stakeholders have really an important role to play here. And as the German national contact point, we want to do our part. And so far, we've been focusing on 3 pillars. First, we've also looked at translation and explanation of what the updated guidelines are about. I'm very pleased that the translation service of the OECD was able to translate the guidelines into German, so they are available on iLibrary since earlier this week. We have also been supporting the OECD Secretariat to work on plain language communication materials to really spread the word about what is new in the guidelines, what the updated guidelines are about. And I think this is absolutely crucial to have plain language communication on a very technical document. Second, we are engaging with our stakeholders to really spread the word of the guidelines and enter into a dialogue and discussion. We started this earlier this week with a big launch event here at the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. Christine Kaufmann, the chair of the working party, was there and presented the targeted update to the German audience. And we then entered into discussion with our key stakeholders, business associations, trade unions, civil society, and also businesses to really discuss what is new in the targeted update and how do we move forward from here. And we want to continue this discussion next week with an event at the Environment Ministry where we really want to focus on the environment chapter. Catherine had said it, there were quite some changes there, and we want to unbox what has changed, what does it mean, how can it be implemented. And besides that, we have a series of presentations lined up. There was a lot of interest in the update of the guidelines. We have presented the guidelines to our chambers of commerce here and abroad, but we also got requests from several universities. So we are really looking forward to talk about the guidelines and promote them here. And the last focus is really how can we support implementation? And that is something that we've started looking into. We want to cooperate with the German Help Desk on Business and Human Rights to have some workshops later this year or early next year to really focus on practical recommendations. How can we implement, how can we support our businesses to implement due diligence and really focus on best practices and lessons learned? And that is something that I am particularly looking forward to as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika, and I know others are too. And indeed, of course, that is also a collective effort for the governments in the OECD and the 51 adherents to the guidelines. So the OECD will, as you also indicated, be coming out with further material, both in terms of explainers and further guidance in terms of some of the new elements, in particular in the environment area. There is a raft of initiatives in the pipeline. You also all spoke about the NCP, and we do have just 1 minute for each of you to just focus in on your national contact points and talk about your plans for aligning your national contact point with the updated procedures as described by Catherine. There have been a number of updates to the procedures. That is a particular, of course, focus for governments that are adhering to the guidelines. Those updates will mean different things for different adherents who have NCPs that are functioning at different levels. But maybe, Eric, I can start with you. What will the French, or has the French NCP done differently because of this update?
Thank you very much, Alan. I will try to make it short. We really welcome very much the update of the procedure because it is crucial to strengthen functional equivalence amongst NCP in the way they handle the specific instances. And it is very important both for the complainant and for the companies. And I think this update will make NCP more efficient in telling ABC stories, which is something very important to attract more new cases. So what about us? The update integrates several practices that were already at the center of the French NCP bylaws. So for us, it's quite easy because we already did that before on a non-binding basis. Let me name in particular 4 elements. The publication of an initial assessment statement to inform the public about new cases. We did that and we will continue to do it because it is crucial, especially in the communication for to have a good framework for communication, both for the complainant and for the company. 2, make sure NCP's coordination remain active throughout the entire procedure. 3, explain the implementation of the guideline in the case at hand and assess compliance to better how to implement RBT norms in real life. And 4, and I think this is really one of the major points, to have a follow-up of the NCP recommendation, including by issuing a follow-up statement. And I'm now president of the French NCP for 7 years, and we are doing it in more than 90% of specific instances in the past, and we will try to reach 100% as of now. I stop there.
Thank you, Eric. You talked about, of course, attracting new cases, and I'm sure there are people in the audience or even in our stakeholder panel who have a few ideas for what that might involve in some of the areas that have seen updates. And you also talk about specifically recommendations where it is now clearer from the procedures that is the norm, that NCPs will make recommendations in specific instances. Minako, if I can go to you next, for the NCP of Japan, what do you see changing because of the updated procedures?
Thank you, Alan. Once again, firstly, one of the key points of the newly updated procedure is stronger requirements on adherence to make available human resources and financial resources. And regarding human resources, the Japanese NCP is an intergovernmental body composed of 3 ministries, and so there are usually 8 or 9 people. But on the other hand, since we are all government staff, frequent turnover means every 2 or 3 years is, in a sense, unavoidable. So in order to ensure the institutional memory of the Japanese NCP, we are trying to update the internal record on the already closed and ongoing cases so that all the new members could have a better insight and learn quickly from the past experiences. Because capacity building of new members is always a challenge for NCP. And secondly, since the new procedures introduced the mandatory peer review, we have started an informal brainstorming on future peer review on the Japanese NCP, including budget issues. And lastly, update of our NCP's procedure guidance is on our pipeline. And we have to admit that we are in a transitional period. So meantime, for instance, as for initial assessment, for the cases already submitted before June, we are using the criteria based on our current procedure guidance, but adding explanation to show the corresponding criteria in the updated version. So newly updated procedures give us a clear motivation to ensure more effective functioning of our NCP, and also realizing the effective NCP network is an evolving process, which needs our constant efforts. And we are very much looking forward to working closely with other adherents and the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you, Minako. You highlight there the importance of resources, a very basic issue, and that, of course, now the mandatory peer reviews is going to be a key vehicle for that gradual upgrade on the resource side as well as the broader capacity side. Lastly, if I can turn to you, Annika, for the NCP of Germany, what will be some of the key changes that you foresee?
Thanks, Alan. First of all, I think what my colleagues were just highlighting on the periodic peer review, I think this is one of the key achievements that we were able to agree to really help improve the national contact points across the board, and we are very much looking forward to starting this. But also beyond that, there were changes that affect the way that we handle complaints, and now the ball is in our court. And here at the German National Contact Point, we have been looking closely at how we are doing our business, how we do our procedures for handling complaints, and we have identified several areas for possible better alignment in our rules of procedure. And we have been preparing internally a first draft of updated rules of procedure, which we will now share with our stakeholders from various ministries, but also with the stakeholders in our advisory body, to then start a discussion about how to update our rules of procedure. And we are very much hoping that we can finish this before the end of the year.
Thank you, Annika, and I'm sure there will be great interest also from outside of Germany and by other NCPs in looking at what you're doing and learning from your experience in updating the rules of procedure. We've gone a little bit over time. I'll now hand over to Catherine, or hand back to Catherine Dovey, who will just give us a sense of some of the questions that you have raised in the chat as we've been going along with the panel. So thank you to our panelists, and Catherine, over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. And yes, thanks to all of our panelists. That was a really nice, rich discussion on what happens next with regards to implementation. And thanks to all of our attendees who put questions in the chat box. Please feel free to keep adding them as we go. I'll deal with a couple of the questions that we've received at the top, and then I'll hand a few over to our panelists that have been explicitly indicated. So just a couple of quick ones. There was a request for some more information about our tech chapter. What I would say about that is point you to a webinar that we're doing that's dedicated entirely to that chapter. That's going to be on the 5th of October. There'll be more information on that in social media very soon, and we'll make sure that you'll get an invitation as well. There was also a practical question about when these new guidelines become operational. You know, obviously it's a soft law instrument, so there's no sort of entry into force per se, but the guidelines were released on the 8th of June on the occasion of the Ministerial Council meeting at the OECD. So that's when they really took over from the 2011 version, and that's what we operate with now. A few questions with regard to developments at the EU and CSDDD, and what we often mention in this regard is that the guidelines, of course, are a different instrument. They are soft law, they are voluntary, and they can often serve as inspiration for other efforts that are going on in this space, whether it's multilateral or domestic, in the aim of consistency in this space. There was a question with regards to follow-up activities from governments, notably in terms of public procurement. And I'd say to that, we would probably point you back to the recommendation that Alan mentioned, which explicitly kind of sets out what the role of governments is now in this space, and activities that we'll be doing in that regard. And then there was also a question with regards responsible business conduct reflecting decency, which I think all of us working in this space very much hope that it does. That's definitely the idea behind the instrument. So that's it from me. We did have a couple of questions specifically for Joanne, one with regards FPIC and one with regards partnerships between Indigenous peoples and companies, and then a couple of specific questions for Vinand. And then Lucia, I saw that you had your hand up as well, so let me bring you in this context. But Joanne, maybe I could hand to you first for those questions aimed at you.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. There are two. One is in relation to if the guidance provide what happens when consent is not given under the FPIC. So the guidance, the guidelines does not provide any further details on the FPIC. That's why we are strongly recommending that there should be further guidance to be developed in the operationalization of the free, prior, and informed consent. And that should be done in a participatory way with Indigenous peoples and should be under an engagement mechanism that will ensure a continuing dialogue with Indigenous peoples, so that these kind of questions can be elaborated in the specific guidance on that. On the question on the transition minerals, on what advice can be given, I think it's important first that the companies engage in building, to engage in a trust building process with affected Indigenous communities through participatory conduct of the human rights due diligence, environmental and social impact studies as a basis for moving forward in the process of obtaining the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples. And also in this regard to define appropriate mitigation measures. And if there's consent provided, then it would be good to get into equitable terms of benefit sharing agreement and establishment of joint monitoring mechanism, as well as the setting up of grievance mechanism. So this is still possible, right? Underpinned by the framework of respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and also involving them as actors in this kind of solutions to climate change. Finally, I just want to mention that one of the things that we're doing now is supporting communities to develop their community protocols on FPIC, because that's also the way where they can assert how their rights will be recognized and how they can effectively have their concerns and their well-being taken into account in any kind of projects by business companies. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive response. That's great. Vinand, if I may turn to you now, you may have seen the two questions aimed at you, one with regards balance and the other with regards supplier contracts. So please, the floor is yours. And I'm afraid to say you're on mute.
Again, yeah. A very brief reaction also on the relation between the guidelines and the European legislation. I stress that the characters, of course, are very different, voluntary guidelines and mandatory legislation. So you cannot have a one-on-one simple transposition, but certainly the guidelines can and should be aspirational and inspirational. And in that sense, I think it's very important in the trilogue phase of the EU legislation now that some concepts, some key concepts of the guidelines are really very carefully transposed. And especially the difference between the responsibility for own acts and acts of others and the proportionality. Then on the question, what could be 2 or 3 main provisions in supplier contracts? I think in the first place, it would be important to refer to the guidelines. I think there should be awareness among both parties in a contract that the guidelines exist and that they contain recommendations for business. Yeah, and then of course it very much depends on the individual sector, because the guidelines stress the risk-based character, and the risk is of course in every sector, in every contract is different. And then the question of Alejandra Albaran on what could be the balance between, on the one hand, ambition and on the other hand, practicality. I think it's clear that there can be tension between sales objectives and compliance. So I think what's extremely important is that in a company, there is an alignment between the compliance department, the sales department, and also the top of the company on where the accent should be put and where the priority should be. And I think in this, the tone at the top is essential to influence the culture within a company, the internal culture, on how to deal with the guidelines and how to find the balance between sales objectives and compliance. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much for those responses. That's wonderful. I know we've had a few more questions as this session has been ongoing, which I will turn to in a second, but let me firstly bring in Lucia Turag.
Yes, thank you. One thing that I would like to add to all the things that have been said is that how important it is that an NCP has a good structure in which stakeholders can participate in the decision-making process. So, of course, stakeholders do not decide, but you can ask them for their advice, for their stories, for their support when it comes down to a filing of a complaint, for instance, unions and workers. When that is being done by NCPs, we see that solutions that all parties are satisfied with come up more easier and more frequently. So it really is a win-win situation. I cannot stress that enough. There are still NCPs that do not want to have kind of stakeholder consultations in a regular way. They don't want to give them a position for all kinds of reasons, but it really helps you. And please consider, and if you are asking yourself why or how, make use of the NCPs that do and that have good experiences with this. Thanks.
Great, very good call to action there. Thank you so much for adding that, Lucia. Okay, let me address some of the other questions that I've seen turning up in the Q&A so far. So there was a good question with regards to potential new adherence to the guidelines. Of course, this is something that we would always encourage, and at the moment engage a lot with countries outside the adherence through our regional programs, thanks to the involvement of the EU and also the work we do with OHCHR and the ILO, for instance, in Latin America and elsewhere. So that's a big part of our work, along with the outreach work that we do. There was a question with regards to whether we will update, for instance, our due diligence guidance on institutional investors. And it's a question that could be asked actually of any of our due diligence guidance. And at the moment, I think what's important to remember is that with the 2023 update of the guidelines, what we've done is we've brought the guidelines in compliance, as it were, with the existing due diligence guidance. So it all sort of matches up now. So no plans to update those immediately. With regards to animal welfare, we don't have a particular piece of work on that, but of course it relates to implementation, and implementation sits with the policymakers and stakeholders, as you've heard today, so it may well be picked up. And then there was also a general question with regards national contact points and whether decisions are binding. And this is a question that we get quite a lot, but given we have 3 great national contact points on the line, let me just pick at random one of them. And Eric, David, I'm going to turn to you to maybe address that question with regards whether you consider NCP decisions to be binding. I know what the answer is, but I'd like you to address it.
Of course, it's not an easy question. On a formal point of view, it's not binding. The question is, what is the reality? The reality is not the same in 2023 than 20 years ago. And it is mainly based on communication and the fact that we all have an internet website, that there is some pressure coming from the market. And at the end of the day, when you published something on your website, with OECD support, with national support, it's clearly obvious that it is something important for the complainant and for the companies. So compulsory not, legally binding now, but it's very, very difficult with the pressure of the market not to follow guidelines recognized by more than 50 countries. So I think that the more the market will be involved, the more communication will be important, the more we have pressure coming from stock exchange investors, the more we will have influence and impact on real things. And that's what matters at the end of the day.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that answer. And let's get a very quick stakeholder perspective on that particular question as well, because it's an important one. Lucia, can I bring you in very briefly on that?
Thank you so much. There is something that I would like to add, because the findings of the NCP sometimes play a role in government's decisions when it comes down to support business. So there is a way you can bind more than by only legally law or things with legislation. That is one thing. And the other thing is we really strive for also commitment of NCPs when business does not come to the table. And that we think that should be judged upon as a breach of the guidelines themselves. If you look at that in this way, again, government can do something when it comes down to criteria for support to business, etc., etc. And we really would like to advocate for that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you for sharing that viewpoint. That's very helpful. I'm going to close the Q&A there. Thank you for all of your questions. If we have missed any, we'll try our best to answer in the chat as we go. But now it gives me a great pleasure to hand over to the chair of the Working Party on Responsible Business Conduct, Christine Kaufmann, to share with us a few closing reflections based on what we've all heard. Christine.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you all for a very rich discussion. I've really been thrilled to listen to you, and it has also confirmed that we are on the right path and that the intentions that we pursue with the targeted update have really been well received. I want to highlight 3 points that I think are particularly relevant. The first one is, as you all stated, we now, with the updated guidelines, we really do have an international standard on RBC that is fit for the future, and most of all, and I think this is very important to remind ourselves, will benefit people in all countries beyond the 51 adherents. This is very important to emphasize. And why do we really think the guidelines will be fit for the future? Because as you all stated, and we heard it in the introduction by Catherine, they do address the key challenges that our society and planet are facing. Think about climate change, biodiversity loss, the digital transformation, to name just a few. So we could safely say the eyes of the guidelines are on the horizon. And I also, at the same time, often then hear the comment, well, you know, these challenges, they are just way too big to be implemented for business, to be implemented by all of us. And I think at this point, it is really, really important to also be aware that while we have the eyes on the horizon, so to speak, we keep the feet safely on the ground. We did not change the DNA of the guidelines. And what do I mean with that DNA? I mean that we have still the risk-based approach. We still have the concept of prioritization. We still have, and this sometimes gets a bit overlooked, we still have this holistic approach. So we look at all risks that may occur for people, for the planet. And what we do with the update, and it was explained very well by the Secretariat, is we elaborate on this DNA. So we explain in more detail what is really expected by business when we talk about due diligence and digital transformation. We also explain what do we mean by this holistic approach. So we look at indigenous peoples, they are now mentioned. We look at human rights defenders, we look at vulnerable groups. So there's a lot of clarification in that regard. And also what I would really point your awareness to, because it's often overlooked, is look at how we address lobbying, how we address reprisals and corruption. So again, it's a very important part of what I would call the DNA of the guidelines. So that means essentially we're ready to go. But as you all noticed, the key, of course, is implementation. And I was very pleased to hear from all of you how you are willing and committed to foster the implementation. That refers to all the 3 stakeholders, but it also refers to government. We talked about NCPs that play a key role in the implementation, and we have many challenges when it comes to improving the NCP system. And this is where I really call also on governments to ensure that we have functioning NCPs, that we do have the funding for the peer reviews that are now mandatory, and peer reviews are just key to improve the system. After all, I'm very optimistic having listened to you, and I count on you, on all the stakeholders, on all the governments, and I'm very sure that we now have the tool to really contribute to sustainable development and a more sustainable economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christine, for those welcome reflections. Wonderful. Well, we've reached the end of today's webinar. I'm very happy to thank all of our participants for joining, all attendees and all panelists. I think it was a really rich discussion that's helping us to move forward. If you liked what you heard today, you can join us again at 3 p.m. Paris time, as we'll be doing a second webinar to meet another set of time zones. And the only other thing I wanted to say in closing is look out for information with regards our next webinars in this series. As I mentioned, one on the 5th of October dedicated to our tech chapter, and one on the 19th of October, all about the environment chapter and notably climate change. So we look forward to welcoming lots of you for that now, but in the meantime, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.